Okay.
Well, good evening. My name is Phil Schomber. I'm the adult programmer here at Hedberg, and I'd like to thank all of you for coming tonight. And it's my pleasure to be able to introduce our speaker, former State Senator Tim Cullen. Senator Cullen has served the city of Janesville and the state of Wisconsin for many years. In 1970, he was elected to the Janesville City Council and then went on to the state Senate, eventually becoming the Senate Majority Leader. He also served as the Secretary of the Department of Health and Family Services under Governor Tommy Thompson, and then went on to become Vice President of Blue Cross Blue Shield of Wisconsin before being reelected to and serving again in the state Senate from 2010 to 2015. In 2008, he was appointed co-chair of the task force that tried to keep the GM plant here in Janesville, and he's written a new book that shares the inside story of what happened and why. And if you don't have a copy of that book, you'll have a chance after the program to purchase one and have Senator Cullen sign it. But before we get there, Senator Cullen's going to share some insights from his book. So would you please welcome Tim Cullen.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. I appreciate all of you being here. At the outset, I just want to say that all the profits from this book go to the Janesville Multicultural Teacher Scholarship. I don't make a dime on this, and that's the way it was with my first book too. And it actually makes it more fun to sell because it isn't like you're trying to convince somebody to put money in your own pocket. So I kind of like that. So that's, and because there's no middleman, when I sell them myself, the profit's $14 out of the $20. The book's $18.95, but I have to collect the sales tax too. So I'm doing my share to balance the state budget by getting that sales tax. But it's, you know, I appreciate you being here. And what I thought I would do is talk a little bit about sort of an overview of the book and then hopefully maybe some questions or comments about it. The first thing I would say, as I mentioned, is the title, which is Disassembled, which is probably pretty clear when you think about the plant closing and then the entire plant being disassembled. And I got this picture from the guy who owns the tavern that's in the parking lot of General Motors. No one knows the address of that plant, but they all know it as the tavern in the parking lot. And certainly Detroit management knew about the tavern in the parking lot. The truth is that the tavern was there first. There were houses there on Jackson Street when the tavern went there. And GM, as they needed more parking space, started buying up all the houses that surrounded the tavern. But the tavern wouldn't sell. And it became more of a problem in the minds of I think, of Detroit management because some guy from the Wall Street Journal came here to wrote a story about him, I don't know, probably over 20 years ago, probably now. And the reporter got just enthralled with this tavern in the parking lot, 100 yards from the front door. So he made it a bigger part of his story in the Wall Street Journal than it probably needed to be. But Detroit management picks up the Wall Street Journal and finds out they've got a tavern in their parking lot. So it was, and if they'd have bought that tavern and thrown them out of business, there were 3 or 4 other taverns within 4 blocks of that plant. Most of them who sold food or would have started selling food, so they would have just gone. And some of them still did go further away. But anyway, that's not a whole lot of the book, although I do talk about the tavern in probably 4 or 5 pages about how that all happened and how it worked from that 30-minute lunch hour that they had. But the subtitle tells more. It says, A Native Son on Janesville and General Motors, Story of Grit, Race, Gender, and Wishful Thinking, and then what it means for America. Amy Goldstein wrote a good book on this, and she spoke here. It was called Janesville, An American Story, and I don't duplicate her book at all. She had 2 core parts of her book. One was she talked about, she traced families followed them who were severely hurt by the closing, and about what it was like to commute to Fort Wayne, 270 miles away, et cetera, and how it affected some families and some kids' plans for college. And she did a really good job, and then she talked about what Janesville was trying to do to recover. She spent a lot of time on that. And I praise her book in my book. I think she did a really good job. I decided I don't need to duplicate any of that, so I don't. I talk more about what happened to the rest of Janesville just to be a citizen here when the plant closed and how it affected them. And then I thought that there was a lot to be learned from all kinds of other communities where there's a heavily dominant reliance on a particular industry or two. What control do you have on keeping them in your community, and what can happen when they leave? So I have like 20 specific points in that chapter about what other communities could learn about the Janesville GM experience. Also, the word disassembled, I liked it because it also, there were two other things that were disassembled in the plant, which were good as compared to the bad one of them closing. One was, as it involved race relations, that GM would not hire black employees. It was unwritten, but it happened. For example, I followed John Scott a lot, who was in 1961 the third black person ever hired at GM. They've been making cars since 1923, and he was the third person hired, and quite a story about how he did get hired. But the first black person who was hired, his name was Al Beck. He got hired in the 50s, and problem is that I've talked to his son. His son is still around Janesville, pretty prominent, nice, well-known guy in the insurance business. But he said his dad did not have sort of the typical curly hair of a black person, male, and he also said his dad's skin was lighter. So what happened was they hired him by mistake. They didn't know they hired a black person. And then, of course, it spread across the plant that he was, in fact, black, and he never denied that he was black. So when the 6-month probation period was just about up, they fired him for no reason at all. And I never could find out who the second one was hired, but John Scott was the third, so I have a whole chapter on him as well. But I'm getting a little bit ahead of the story in any kind of sequence, but they then, with the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was a key part of it, which for the first time said that you could not discriminate based on race, gender, et cetera, in private employment. There had been laws against discriminating in those areas in public employment. And that really changed everything. It certainly didn't change everybody's views and attitudes and so on, but it changed the law. And GM started hiring black people. In fact, I talk about one fellow who helped me with the research in the book a lot, Bruce Penny, who was the president of the union at one time. When he first got hired at the plant in 1970, he said there were 18 guys hired the day that he started, and he was the only white guy. All the rest of them are black, so they got the message and were catching up. And interesting, the issue was always black and white. The issue wasn't about Hispanic and Native American, Asian. It was always about black and white was the problem. And then I write about Doris Tome, who many of you may have known or heard of in Janesville. Up until 1965, so you go from 1923 to 65, they would not let women work on the assembly line. And if you worked there as a woman, there weren't that many, they put you on this little cushion line, which is a little area, which I worked on a little bit, that was surrounded by stacks of materials and parts and stuff. So if you toured the plant, you wouldn't even see the cushion line. The stacks of material were higher than this ceiling. And they paid them less than the men on the assembly line. And the reason they gave, it wasn't written, but the generic reason was if you let those women work on the assembly line, they'll break up a bunch of marriages. So we gotta keep them over here. Well, Doris Tome wanted to get paid the same as men. And so she got the Civil Rights Act of 64 in her hand, went in to see the plant manager and said, I want to work in the assembly line. If you won't hire me there, I'm going to sue you, and I've got the law on my side. And the plant manager just didn't even try to fight her. He said, okay, you can work on the assembly line. So that was how she busted. But there's a whole chapter on it wasn't all quite that simple, and the way she was treated when she got there wasn't very nice, and how she fought through it is, I think, pretty remarkable. And she just died 2 years ago at the most, at age 97. She was a remarkable person. I interviewed her daughter, Pat, several times about it. She gave me a lot of documents and stuff as well. So 2 things got disassembled that were good. They started paying women equal pay with men, and they started hiring people of all colors. So Those are the good disassemblies that happen. Another thing you might just in general ask is, why does this guy who happened to be the state senator, how is he qualified to write a book like this? And just say I'm the third generation in my family to work there. My grandpa was there when they started making Chevrolets. He worked for Samson Tractor, then he was there making Chevrolets in 23 and 24, and left to be a janitor in the Janesville School District because I think he believed it was a more secure job than this new company that was just getting started, General Motors. There were a lot of car companies trying to be a survivor back then. So he went off to be, and he was a janitor until he was 75 years old. You can imagine that. He never retired until he was 75 years old. By that time, he was at Roosevelt Elementary School. And then my dad worked there from 48 to 71. And the advantage I got from that was they would hire the sons of workers for summer jobs because they had vacations to fill in and everything else. So it worked good for them because they didn't want to hire full-time people for this summertime need. So I had a chance to work there for 4 summers and paid my entire way through Whitewater by working there, everything. And lived over there, room, board, everything, tuition. And what's interesting about that is, as you may have noticed, I said they would hire the sons of workers, not the daughters. And I really think, I think back at that time, it was kind of a rough place to work. There were a lot of language and behavior and stuff that you put a few thousand people together. And I think a lot of the dads down there didn't want their 18-year-old daughter working there. And I think that they didn't mind that. But I don't remember ever thinking about that at that time, going, why can't the daughters? But there was some tough language. There are a lot of really wonderful people, but when you have that many, you're going to have some good and some bad as well. So that happened. The book kind of evolved, I want to say. I initially was going to write a book that was just about the 25 years before GM left and all the things that happened. We almost lost the plant in '86. And then what happened leading up to 2008, and why did it close in '08? Why did we get closed? And some other plants stayed open. And then I was going to cover like the 11 years since the plant closed and what's going on in Janesville since then. But then I got into the race issue and the gender issue, and then that got into the chapters on Doris and John Scott. And then I also got into Walter Reuther, and he was the president of the International Union from 1946 to 1970, and really was the guy who built the union. And remarkable guy. I read a couple books on him, and I hadn't heard of him and knew of him, but he was a remarkable American. He was much more broad thinking than you would think of a union leader. Most union leaders are focused solely on, getting more or whatever for their own workers, whoever's in their members of their union. But he was into the civil rights movement. He was in the environmental movement. He was a remarkable guy. He cleaned the communists and the mob out of the UAW, and they tried to assassinate him. Lucky he survived it. Then they tried to assassinate his brother. He survived even though he lost an eye. So there's a whole chapter on Reuther as well. But then I focus a lot on 1986 because GM announced in '84 that they were sending the pickup truck production to Fort Wayne, where they were building a brand new plant. And they did that. They announced it in '84, but the plant wasn't ready, so they didn't actually move the workload until '86. But during '84, '85, and '86, GM is completely silent on any replacement product. And that workload was 1,800 jobs, and it emptied well over half the physical capacity of the plant, not quite 2/3. And GM's silent, so what's going to happen? You're not going to likely have a half-empty plant for a long time. You're either going to get a new product or they're going to close it. And that's where Jim Lee comes in. He was a shop chairman. We all generally know about whoever the president of the union is, but the real influential key person inside the plant is the shop chairman. The shop chairman is the one that negotiates any changes to the contract with management, and then has to sell it to the union membership. Whatever changes he negotiates, it goes to a full vote of the membership. So he was a key person, and he was the key person at the right time in '86 to realize he watched some more plants getting closed by GM, and he was the guy who figured out, we have to make some changes here to impress Detroit so they'll give us another product, keep us open. And that's what he did. That's when we went to the 4-day, 10-hour shift was in that negotiation that he had. Another big thing he did was there were 93 different job classifications there, which made it incredibly hard to manage the place if you think about it, because they say to you, would you please go over there and get that broom and take it over there? And you'd say, well, that's not in my job classification. You got to find somebody that moves brooms. And so you can imagine how complicated it would be, because then if somebody was absent or whatever, you had to find somebody who fit into one of their job classification. And Lee negotiated it right down from 93 to 3, which was enormously helpful to GM. And the 410s was enormously helpful to GM because the cost of running the paint shop was huge. And so by not having to fire up the paint shop 1 out of 5 days, you're saving 20% of the cost. Now, sometimes they got into overtime, but that was because they were selling. That saved them a lot of money. They also did things that didn't cost any money to show that the management and union were trying to work on this together. And one of them was that when you worked in the union, you always had you had a time card. You had to punch in and punch out. And I remember when I worked there, at the end of the shift, there's this long line. You had to stood in this long line waiting to get up there because it took a little while to punch out. You couldn't just walk right out the door fast. And so they said, well, the management doesn't punch out, so let's not have the union members punch out either. And then before that, management got all the front row parking spots, and the union guys parked wherever they could, wherever it was far away. And they just got rid of all preferred parking. The plant manager got their lady parked in row 7. And neither one of those saved money, but they sent a message inside the plant and a message to Detroit. And they agreed on a whole bunch of other changes as well. And then they go to Detroit, and two other companies, they were competing for the medium-duty truck, which had been at Pontiac, Michigan, but there was a huge labor dispute there, and GM was trying to send the UAW message. So they were going to take the medium-duty truck out of Pontiac and send it somewhere else. Now, Pontiac had like 40,000 employees, so this wasn't like a closed Pontiac. And we were competing with 2 other plants, went to Detroit to make the final pitch, and Jim Lee, who had a great way with words, to say the least, I knew him fairly well. He's an amazing human being. But they made their pitch, and the final pitch was from Jim Lee, and he says to them, and he was referring, I think, to the fact that the GM and Janesville UAW had agreed to all these changes, but never got any reward for it. So he says to the lead guy from the management side, he says, how long, he says, can a dog walk around a cold barn with a frozen turd in his mouth? And that was the ending pitch. Well, Detroit management leaves the room, and everybody's going, man, did he blow it? I mean, did Jim Lee finally say something that just wasn't going to be helpful at all? And the Detroit management came back, and the guy who he was speaking to, he says, I have never been talked to that way in all my years in this job. And then he paused and he said, but I've never been more impressed. And it turned out it didn't hurt at all, it helped. And then they did award us the product. And then 2 years later, we got the SUVs and the big trucks, and we were on our way. But there was that time there. Talking about a lot of other things that were going on at the same time, but it was, and so we kind of sailed through the 90s and 2000s. We kept adding employees for the SUVs because they were selling like crazy. They were making GM was making $10,000 of profit on one vehicle, and they were doing them at one a minute. So that was $600,000 an hour, and multiply that by 20 hours a day, and 4 days a week. I think it came to like $48 million a week GM was making here. So, and we were efficient too. But then point out that almost everything that could go wrong around 2008 went wrong. We had national recession, which hurt a lot. Gas prices all of a sudden shot to $4 a gallon, and people stopped buying vehicles because in a recession or at $4 a gallon, you can make your current vehicle last a couple more years and not buy a new one. And a lot of these decisions are based on political power, and we didn't really have anybody in our congressional delegation who really had a lot of power. Back in the 80s, early 90s, we had Les Aspin, who was chairman of Armed Services Committee, and GM had defense contracts, so they really cared about Aspin. And Paul Ryan in 2008 was then a junior member of the party in the minority, which is a long ways from power. I mean, people think of Paul Ryan being speaker in 2015, but in 2008 he was nowhere near that. So we didn't have anybody the likes of what Les Aspin was or what Paul Ryan became in terms of power in Washington. And Michigan had John Dingell, who was enormously powerful, not a well-known guy, but he was certainly well-known to GM. He chaired the Energy and Commerce Committee, which had oversight of fuel emission standards and miles per gallon standards and everything that GM cared about. He had control over that. And because we, in 08, we were told point blank, they're going to move this SUV production to Arlington, Texas. It was the one other plant in the country where they were making SUVs. And so our chance was they had this fuel-efficient vehicle called a Chevy Spark. And that's what we were really trying to save the plant with, was to get them to put the Chevy Spark here. And of course, we put in a good bid. There's I explain in the book how the bids went and how we really got taken to the cleaners on how they handled the bids. And they never gave us a second chance. They said they'd give us. And of course, where did the Chevy Spark go? Went to Michigan, where John Dingell was congressman. So that was it. Since the plant closed, I talked pretty specifically, without trying to be too negative or critical, that it was always going to take a long time for Janesville to recover. I mean, between the plant and the supplier plants like Lear Seating and the other ones, there were 4,500 people who lost their jobs in 1 year, one calendar year, and good paying jobs. The person on the assembly line, which was about the lowest paying job there, in 2008, was making $28 an hour plus benefits. So this was truly middle class jobs, and they were all gone. It wasn't. So absent two things, either GM comes back, which didn't happen. And GM, by the way, closed 28 plants between 07 and 09 when they went through bankruptcy. I talk about the bankruptcy a lot in the book as well. So they closed 28 plants, even though they got going roaring again by 2012 or so, 2013. They only reopened 2 of those 28 plants. One of their reasons why they went broke was they had a way over capacity problem, which they wouldn't deal with. You say, well, then why didn't they close Janesville? Well, they had to close some places, but we of course, were hoping it wouldn't be us. And they moved the product to Arlington, even though they admitted that we were more efficient. We produced the vehicles that they were going to send to Arlington. We produced them at lower per vehicle cost than Arlington. GM said so. But Arlington had a lot of other things going for them. They were a newer plant. They were on 1 floor. We were on 2 floors. They didn't build any new plants with 2 floors. They wanted all on 1 floor. It's easier to get product in and out. And also, they had a more up-to-date modern paint shop compared to ours. And our paint shop was also on the 2nd floor, which was another problem. You had to lift every vehicle up to the 2nd floor to paint it, and then get it back down on the main floor for the rest of the production. So they had a lot going for us. And Texas was a huge market for SUVs. They call them Texas Cadillacs down there then. So they producing them there and not having the cost of delivering them and so on was helpful to them. And also was, I don't think this really mattered, but it was also the home state of then President Bush, because this whole business of the time we close and the bankruptcy occurs in 2 presidencies. President Bush is the lame duck president until January of 09, when the new president, President Obama, is sworn in. But President Obama said right after the election, he said America is one president at a time, therefore George W. Bush is the president until January 20th. So GM was negotiating with the George W. Bush administration for a bailout. They were trying to avoid bankruptcy. They just wanted $25 billion. That's all. Just we're not going to commit to changing anything. Just give us $25 billion. And he was going to, President Bush was going to go and retire in Texas. So I couldn't prove this, but everybody was very critical, and rightly so, about the fact they closed the plant 2 days before Christmas. They announced it like with 6 or 8 weeks ahead of time. They were going to close it on December 23rd, and a lot of people thought that was sort of a cruel thing to do, that it couldn't have made that much difference to wait a while, wait a few weeks or whatever. But my guess is two things, and I don't have any proof of it. One is that they wanted to show President Bush and his administration that they were serious about cost cutting, and President Bush, of course, would like to have the jobs go to Texas, where he was going to retire and where he had been governor. So that part kind of made sense. And also, just being the cynic of being around politics for a long time, I can't help but think that President Obama probably did not mind the plant being closed while President Bush was president, not while he was president. Because he had come here and given a speech. I've talked about that and put the whole speech in the back of the book, where a lot of people thought they heard him say that if he was elected president, they'd keep it open. And I've read the whole speech. He never said that, but he said things that sounded awfully good. I was there. I was there when he gave the speech. So absent GM coming back, or absent another large company with 2,000 or 3,000 jobs coming to fill that building, the recovery for Janesville was always going to be slow. It was always going to take a lot longer time. And in fact, one of the things I use to measure poverty, so I'm not even talking about middle-class jobs here, and I'm talking about poverty, is what they call the free and reduced lunch program in the schools. Kids from families whose household income is a certain level, depending on how many people are in the family, it slides depending on the number of people in the home. But for a family of four, the household income has to be $39,000 or less, which could be one job, it could be two jobs, it could be three jobs, depending on how many adults are in that home. And so that I think is a great measurement of poverty. And the year before the plant closes, 33% of the kids in Janesville are eligible for free and reduced lunch, 33%. The year after the plant closes, that 33% jumps to 51%. And today, 11 years later, it's 52%. I mean, it just has not come back at all in 11 years. So I understand the need for community leaders to cheerlead for the community and point out all the positives of the community. And that's their job, and that's what they should do. But the reality is that we're coming back slowly. Middle class, upper middle class people are doing fine in Janesville, but the poverty levels have increased and stayed high. And we have these closets in both high schools and both high schools and two of the three middle schools and some elementary schools. These closets are rooms in the school, a room that's set aside, no tax money. People just give clothing and other personal items that kids need in their homes, and it's all private money, or just give money for them to go buy stuff. And a lot of retired teachers volunteer to sort of staff it, and then kids come to school, and I've been in those rooms, and they've got they got sweatshirts and tennis shoes and shampoo and toothpaste, all kinds of personal items, and they started those in around 2010, and they're still going, they're still needed, and there's no tax money involved in it at all. It's all volunteer, people giving stuff or giving money. So it's been a long haul back. I also want to mention that there's another author I mentioned Amy Goldstein, but Steve Ratner, Rattner, he was Obama's point man on the bankruptcy. And he wrote a book called Overhaul, Overhaul. And I refer to it a lot in my book, but if you're looking for another book you want to read, it's remarkable because he has this army of staff from the Department of the Treasury who get into GM's books at the time of the bankruptcy, because Obama said, "I'll save the auto industry by bailing out Chrysler and GM." Ford did not get a bailout, didn't want one, but he said to his staff, he said, "But I want an efficient company coming out the other side of bankruptcy that can make money to pay the taxpayers back," so they got into their books, and it's just remarkable. It was a hugely top-heavy, multi-layered bureaucracy that they never dealt with. They had terrible deals with their suppliers. They had terrible deals with their dealers, and they had way too much overcapacity. In fact, when times are really going good right now, they have been for the auto industry. When the current CEO, Mary Barra, you saw all this, that she would close some plants and laid some people off, and there was this huge strike that went on for 45 days, just ended. But what jumped out at me was she said, when she made the announcement, which, by the way, she laid off more white-collar workers than she did union workers in the plan that she had. But she said then that GM was operating at 70% capacity in 2019. And I'm going, they still really didn't solve, because they were roaring, and they were working they had triple shifts at lots of plants. And they were down to 70% capacity. So they had 30% of their space was wasted and costly, even after good times had come back to the industry. So I could go on and on. I have one quote from Walter Reuther, which he said in 1947. He said that, very simply, he said, labor and management have a lot more in common than they realize. And I find that so true as I wrote the book and read about it. And I sort of separate, there's like local management and there's Detroit management. But local management has almost the same desires and interests as the union, which is to keep the jobs here, right? If the plant goes, all the management people lose their jobs too. And in a community like Janesville, an awful lot of the management, foremen, general foremen and so on, were Janesville people from the beginning. So they were very much related to the community. And I find that so true, because I look at all the big things that really hurt the industry, like the problem, they were not the cause of the guy sitting across the table from you at negotiations. I mean, they didn't cause Hitler to start World War II, which stopped the plant from producing for 3.5 years. The guy across the table didn't cause the Great Depression, didn't cause Japanese vehicles to come here with fuel-efficient vehicles. They didn't cause, gas to go to $4 a gallon. I mean, all the big things that really, they didn't cause the Great Recession of 2007, 2008. So all the big things that really hurt the industry really were not, like I said, the problem with the person across the table, the management person or the union person. Jim Lee saw through that. That's why he was so key in 1986 to do that. So I think I will stop there, but I'd be glad to take any questions or comments from that matter. And I appreciate you all coming here tonight. I do. Any questions? Yes.
Oh, let me get you the mic so everybody can hear.
At least they can't see me. Senator, you mentioned about the poverty rate in Janesville.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe I'm the minority, but I don't consider Janesville to be a poor town. I don't consider it to be rich, but I do consider it to be middle class. And for there to be 51 or 52% of the kids getting help with their meals and stuff at school, I just find that unbelievable. I'm not doubting you, but it's hard to fathom how that can be. If there's 51 or 52% in Janesville, what are there in Beloit or some other towns that we would consider doing not as well as Janesville?
Beloit, I believe, is somewhere near 70%. But Janesville is, it depends on where you drive around Janesville. I mean, if you look at, there are some nice homes in this area. I don't mean that at all. But if you just start at Wilson School and go up the west side of the river, probably anywhere from 6 to 12 blocks wide from the river, and you go from Wilson School to the hospital about, there is enormous amount of poverty. You can just drive down the street and just look at the homes and the condition of the homes. And then there are other parts of Janesville that are, and in fact, when you look at the free and reduced lunch, at Harrison Elementary School on the east side, which is probably the most affluent area of Janesville, that number is 29%, even there, but it's only 29% of the kids at Harrison are eligible for free and reduced lunch. It's 93% at Wilson. So it really depends on what part of Janesville you spend your time or you're driving around. There's just a lot of poverty. I can remember when I was mentioned I was on the council like almost 50 years ago. I remember then going around getting more familiar with parts of Janesville. And then 50 years ago, there were no areas of poverty. There was a poor family in this block and another one in this block and so on. But there were not just blocks and blocks of low-income people. So it really depends on what part of Janesville you're talking about. Yes?
Well, I'm not a native here, but my wife and I have lived here almost 50 years. Okay.
You're close to qualifying. Close, close.
What is the cutoff? 75.
We're tough on that.
Well, one of my observations is in the 47 years that we've been here is I'm not trying to blame anybody or in particular, but it seems to me that when World War II ended, Janesville was out at Mount Zion. That's what the old-timers tell me. There wasn't much beyond Mount Zion in 1945. Well, the one thing led to another, and the circuit now is, this is my own opinion, the circuit now is really Milton Avenue. And Highway 14 and Milton Avenue and so forth, that's the area of retail and so forth and so forth. And the 4th Ward, which is where I've done a lot of research on the first families that arrived here, and the first 4 families arrived in 1835 on the General Motors side of, you know, the big rock down there, the Monterey Rock. And Henry Janes didn't get here, the namesake. He didn't get here until 1836. But the point I'm making again is that everything just went north and east, and my impression is the city council and whoever, they have neglected the south side. They've done this year after year. Now there's no grocery stores there, and et cetera, and so forth. I guess my real point is, you know, all the economic growth, it just keeps going north and east. Not all of it, but a lot of it in the last 50 years, or at least since we've been here, and not much priority has been put on the other areas of the city.
Well, there's one major explanation for that, and it's called Interstate 90. When the federal government decided to run the interstate up the east side and then over the top of the north side of Janesville, it created a lot of what you just talked about. In fact, I can remember they completed the interstate from here to Madison, I remember in 1961. Reason why I remember that was I played in the high school basketball team, and when I was a sophomore, we took the bus up 14, and I can remember when I was a junior, we could go up the interstate. That's why I remember, only reason I can remember exactly when it was built. But when they built that I-90 on the east side of Janesville, there were lots of people who said that was going to stop growth on the east side of Janesville. Well, as we all know, it whooshed right past the interstate for blocks and blocks. In fact, interstate's getting closer to being sort of inner city, not really exactly, but it's getting a lot closer to that. So it didn't stop growth that way. And then there were, and all of a sudden restaurants and hotels and motels wanted to be near the interstate. And then I was on the council when they wanted to build the Janesville Mall. And a lot of people said, the council should tell the mall where it can be built. And I just didn't think that was, I was pretty young then, but I didn't think that was our business. How can you tell somebody where they got to invest millions and millions of dollars? I just didn't think so. And they wanted to put it on Milton Avenue, and that had a huge factor. There's no question about it. But that's where they thought they could make a successful mall work economically, or they would have put it somewhere else. And I don't know. This whole thing about the grocery store on the south side is, I also don't know how the government tells a grocery store where they have to be. And I hope that ends up that somebody, maybe a smaller sized grocery store can make it there, but somebody's going to have to want to put their money out there and build it. I would, probably like all of you would love to see it happen. But I don't know how you make a business.
I just don't see any reversal of, in all these years that we lived here, of the city continuing to grow north and east. I don't see any evidence of it. There's been some on the west side and so forth, but it just keeps going north and east.
Yeah, well, when they built Parker High School out there opened in 1968, everybody thought, and at that time there was farmland for blocks and blocks before you got to Parker High School, and everybody thought that would just whoosh, they would just build out there, and it took the better part of a couple of decades at least to get housing out as far as Parker. I don't know, because the west side, if you think about it, where did William Tallman build his house? He built it on the west side, which was then, actually was kind of like the west side of Janesville then. It's right basically downtown now. Yes?
To the gentleman's point, I also think part of it is the path of least resistance. I think the south side of Janesville and some of the rural townships and stuff have been more adamant about trying to prevent annexation and development, and I think that's part of it. But now you will see on the south side of Janesville, there's a lot of large commercial buildings going up and being developed, but no retail.
Yeah.
And if you don't have retail, you aren't going to have houses, and if you don't have houses, you aren't going to have retail. So is it the chicken or the egg?
Yeah. Yes.
I'd just like to comment on, the 52% of the kids on free or reduced lunches, and it made me think that the recovery still hasn't happened. In Janesville, you said it was very slow, and the big reason, and I'm coming from the perspective of, for quite a while I worked with the homeless at the homeless center, and people are surprised when they hear it about 85% of the people at the homeless center are working. So things like, when you hear, 3.5% unemployment rate or something like that, it's meaningless because of the type of jobs. I mean, we had single mothers at the House of Mercy there, be working at 2 different restaurants, working 45 hours a week, really hard labor, and they'd average about maybe $10 an hour. When they can get the shifts and the hours. So the point that I'm trying to make is the recovery of Janesville came, and there's jobs all over the place now. But you mentioned it, retail, restaurant jobs, warehouse jobs, service type, low-level service type jobs, and it doesn't replace a middle-class wage like, the GM plant provided. So I guess my comment is,
that's for sure.
It doesn't surprise me at all.
Well, the other thing that happened is that there was sort of like a domino. First of all, I want to say about the restaurant workers. Everybody talks about how the minimum wage has been raised, and it's either $7.25 or $7.50. I always get that mixed up. But we have a minimum wage for what they call tipped employees who work at restaurants and places where customers tip them. Our minimum wage for tipped employees is $2.25 an hour. Still is today. So that person working 45 hours really has to get tips to remotely have a chance to make a living, and they don't. It all depends on whether their customers leave tips or not. So, but somebody else, yes.
I'm sure some of you must have seen in the paper this week. It just blew my mind. It said 44% of the workers in our country are making $18,000 or less, which puts them in the poverty level. So, my question to you would be, what are your feelings about, will union wages and opportunities ever come back?
Well, I actually write about that in the book. I write about the future of assembly line jobs and the future of unions. And I separate the union question from public unions versus private unions. Public unions are going to come back strong, basically based on politics. It's going to be who's in power, and that's going to determine. Now, there still are now lots of jobs in teaching and in public sector in the city, the county, and so on. The jobs are still there, and the wages are still decent, but the union strength is gone. And then there's the private sector, where what I conclude is it's really going to depend on management as much as anything. If management sees that they don't have a union, and if management reverts to behaviors of the 1920s and 30s and treats employees poorly and don't pay them, and et cetera, unions will come back just like they did in the 1930s. And I hope, one of the things I predict that may happen is that I think the millennial generation, and I happen to have a daughter that's in it, but I'm really impressed with them. And they don't particularly like unions from a lot of the friends I got to know and talk to. But they do believe in paying workers fairly and treating them fairly. And so when that generation gets in the power and starts running companies and so on, if they retain those values I just described, it's going to be tough for unions to come back, because the reasons to have a union are going to be less than they were in the 30s. So I think that's just yet to be determined. But what's happening, you talk about the pay of the jobs. What happened was when people lost $28 an hour jobs, they then started competing for the $18 to $20 an hour jobs, which created too many people in that wage range, which pushed some of them to $14 an hour jobs. And this is like a domino effect all the way to minimum wage. And that's what's happened here. If you were the one that said, whoever said, I totally agree. The unemployment rate, to me, is not a relevant number anymore. It's nice. I'd like to have it be lower than higher and all that. But you talk about the pay in Rock County and so on. The United Way, which is not really a political, I don't think anybody thinks the United Way is a left-wing or right-wing organization. They do a national study, and it's called ALICE, and ALICE is an acronym. But it's about working families, and they're above poverty level, but they're working and they're not doing very well. And that study said that 60% of adults in Rock County make $20 an hour or less. 60% of the adults. And $20 an hour is, it depends on how many people are working and how many jobs you got. You can make a go at it, but that's basically $40,000 a year if you're working 2,000 hours a year. So, but 60% are at that or below that, and that includes the whole county, not just Janesville. But actually, when you talk about GM, you have to talk about the whole county, because never more than 60% of the employees worked in Janesville. It was always somewhere in the 40, even the 45% of the employees there worked somewhere else, lived somewhere else in the county, or even on the edges of the county. They drove from Monroe and Fort Atkinson and Whitewater, Delavan, et cetera. That's the other thing is that everybody talks about what this thing did to Janesville. What it did to Rock County was quite amazing.
Such a discrepancy. Let's see, how do I say this? Okay, I'm a baseball fan, so I'm listening to the radio. And Strasburg, the pitcher for the Washington Nationals, they just won the World Series. And he's probably going to get a contract around $300 million.
I think he got 245.
Is that what it was?
Yeah.
Not bad.
Yeah, he did. Yeah.
I had a pretty good curveball. No, I didn't.
Good changeup.
Yeah, it was supposed to be a fastball, but it was more like a changeup. Yeah, I know it. Well, that's a whole nother issue that I don't address. Yeah. Yeah.
That's where all the money comes from. None of them are worth it, but it's still, that's where it comes from.
Yeah. My idol when I was growing up was Eddie Matthews. He was the third baseman for the Milwaukee Braves, and I loved the guy. He came to the Braves in '53 when they came to Milwaukee in '53, so I was 9, and I just loved baseball, and I loved Eddie Matthews. And then I found out that Eddie Matthews drove a 1957 powder blue Chevrolet convertible. And then I thought he was the greatest guy that ever lived. I mean, but what I've thought about since then is, think about that, what's happened to salaries of major league players. That was, I would guess, his only family car was a Chevrolet. Can you imagine how many cars Strasburg can buy, or any of these guys can buy? And they do. They got 3, 4, 5 cars, Mercedes, et cetera. But the pay level in 1953 for a guy who hit 47 home runs that year was...
I think we still have to deal with the 1% situation. We're still struggling with that. If you know what I mean, the 1%.
Yeah.
It seems like too much of the money, and I don't want to sound socialistic because I don't think I really am, but it's just the 1% is just, they're getting all the money.
Well, that's why unions may come back. Another reason why they might come back. Because it's certainly true. The problem is that I don't think a lot of us live our lives, in a certain area or whatever. I don't know how many people actually drive all around Janesville or drive all around Beloit in the course of their life. It just doesn't happen, I don't think. But just to see just really the abject poverty that exists is really, really discouraging, and people could find reasons for it and explain away or whatever, but it's remarkable. I mean, Beloit went through it. Their big hurt was earlier than us. They entirely lost the Beloit Corporation, which was huge. They had thousands of employees. And Fairbanks Morse was the other big one. Fairbanks Morse, I can remember shaking hands at the plant gate back in the 70s. They had 4,000 or 5,000 employees at Fairbanks Morse. They're down to like 300 or 400 now that are still there. So they took the big hit earlier than we did, but they took it. 400 or 500 of the people who worked here lived in Beloit, so they took a hit when Janesville closed too. But I wish I had a lot of answers to some of these things, and I'd be president probably. But I don't know. And one of the problems the unions are going to have is that when your mom or dad or both of them are in a union and you grow up in a union family, you're more likely to believe in unions and want one wherever you work. But as unions dissipate in numbers, there's going to be a generation growing up whose parents are not in unions, so they're not going to be automatically inclined to want a union. And a lot of people think unions are just, that they're awful, we should try to get along without them. But I don't know. I mean, I grew up in a union family, and it made all the difference in the world in my life. And my dad never finished 10th grade. In fact, I have to tell you one little thing that I'm so proud of. It's a coincidence. Walter Reuther, when he was in 1923, when he was 15 years old, he dropped out of school to get a job because he was the oldest brother, and that was very common in those generations, that the oldest son dropped out of school and got a job to help support the family. And I'm reading it. I'm going, unbelievable. Because that's exactly how old my dad was, in exactly the same year, and exactly the same reason that my dad quit school. He was 15 in 1923, and he quit. He was the oldest boy, and he quit school to get a job to help support the family, which also was the same year, basically, that his dad became the janitor rather than working at GM. And so I suspect there was a pay cut. And but I just was stunned that this was that coincidence. I thought, wow, my dad and Walter Reuther have something in common, you know. But any other questions? I know some of you.
This side has been a little bit more talkative. Anything from this side?
Yeah, all right.
Wasn't there a bunch of money given to GM 10 years ago to bail them out?
There was job training money that was given to them probably 20 years ago, somewhere around 2000.
No, from Obama's administration.
Well, you're talking about the Janesville got or GM?
No,
GM in general?
the
GM
auto
got.
industry.
Well, yeah, he had that. What was the name of that pot of money that they passed in '09 to try to fix? What was the name of that? It was.
I thought they got that big bailout, and then they closed GM and opened up in Mexico. Closed Janesville.
Well, when they closed Janesville, that's a good question. What happened to the jobs that left Janesville? The medium-duty truck that we got in '87, they sent back to Michigan in '04. John Dingle again. But it didn't hurt Janesville so much because they were hiring so many new people that the year that they went, we netted out. We had more jobs after they left because they hired more people for the medium-duty truck or for the SUVs than we lost to Michigan for the medium-duty truck. Then when the plant closed in 2008, most of the production went to Arlington, Texas, like I said. Some of it went to, I always have trouble remembering how to pronounce it, to the plant in Mexico. But the plant in Mexico, it turns out, produced a different vehicle than we did because the other countries, unlike the United States, have fewer emission standards and per mileage, per mile gallon requirements and so on. And so Mexico is the GM plant that produces the vehicles at a less cost with less on them to sell to other countries. So even though they have a plant, Cielo, I think is the name of the community, they don't sell much back in the United States. And it was only a small portion of our workload that went to Mexico. Most of it went to Arlington. And then the product we didn't get, the Chevy Spark, went to Michigan. So we were really not, we didn't get closed because of products going overseas. That wasn't true of us. It could make a case about a lot of other places, but it wasn't true here.
How about the Janesville people that moved to other GM plants and now they got hit with the strike and more plant closings?
Well, they went all over in '08. A lot of them went to Fort Wayne, but they went to Kansas City, they went to Arlington, for example. They went to Lordstown. They went to a lot of places. In a lot of cases, families just moved. In some cases, they tried to commute if it was. But to this day, we have people commuting to Kansas City still. They're trying to get their 30 years in for their pension. What was?
A recent strike.
Yeah.
And it's like getting hit twice.
Yeah. Well, I happen to drive a Buick LaCrosse. I always drive a GM car. They're not going to make Buick LaCrosses in America anymore. This is the last Buick LaCrosse I'm going to have. I'm going to buy a Chevy next year. I think they still make Impalas, I think. But what GM said when they announced the closing of Lordstown and a plant in Canada, I think there was a total of 4. They lay off 15,000 workers, 8,000 of whom are white collar. They said that 5 years ago, 65% of their sales were cars, and 5 years later, that 65% is now down to 50%. Now half, so the plants that make the big vehicles, the trucks and the SUVs and so on, they did okay in the cuts that Chairman Barra or President or whatever, CEO Barra proposed. But the plants that got hurt were the ones that made cars, because the American people have decided not to buy cars. And I don't know who you blame that on.
We can talk all we want about government bailouts for the auto industry, but we subsidize corporate welfare, the airlines, the railroads, right? The farmers.
Oil,
it just passed
oil companies.
Oil companies. I don't think we should forget that either.
I don't think we should forget the vote. That has 100% to do with how you vote.
They just passed a farm bill for the millionaire farmers, the big corporate guys and gals of, what was it, $100 billion?
When you got a $22 trillion debt, they don't know how much they think about $100 billion anymore. It's like, well, it's a couple percent or half, whatever. Well, anyway, any other questions? One of my things is I can't solve a lot of problems. I'd like to. Yes.
What do you think, Tim? Any idea of what or when something's going to move in where the GM plant was, or what it could be? Or could it be some decent paying jobs coming to town, or any thoughts?
I wish I could say something really optimistically, but when I've tried to follow in the paper what the company that bought the land, they're not going to. They're a developer. They don't run businesses or plants there, but in their public comments, they have talked about this is a great site because it has 2 different rail lines that come into it, an interstate highway right near it, and an airport, and a great access to utility services. And we have 2 hospitals, and we have access to health care. But when they kept talking about in the interstate, they were talking about the pluses of the 2 railroads and the interstate and the airport. They mentioned that it would be a good place for distribution centers, which is what we have on the south side. And if you've been out there, that's one of the biggest buildings I've ever seen, other than GM. And I don't know if there's more than 300 employees in there. I could be wrong. I probably shouldn't even say a number, but distribution centers they require a lot of space, but they don't require a lot of employees. So if manufacturers come into that light, and they put out a plan. I mean, we're talking about 4 million square feet, and they put out a plan which said they could have a 545,000 square foot building here and a 300,000. They had 5 or 6 different proposals, but somebody has to want to come there and do something. It's good to have a plan like that, but somebody has to want to come there. And will they come there to manufacture something, or will they come there to run a distribution center? And I don't obviously know the answer to that, but I mean, the new wage in Janesville really is basically about $18 an hour. That's if you're in any kind of production of any kind, manufacturing, light manufacturing, whatever. It's about $18 is the top. And yes.
My concern is that when General Motors was here and we were such a wealthy community, it didn't really matter that the citizens had taxation without representation because life was pretty good. But now that General Motors is gone, my concern is that we don't really have a budget committee. We don't have control over, we don't have ward supervisors or block captains. The council members are voted at large. They tend to represent the maybe top 3 to 5% of the wealthier people in the community. And we have 3 city managers right now. We have so many department heads that make 6 figures. Our water bill went up. We got the wheel tax. We got the garbage tax. And friends of mine who are bankers are telling me people are coming in crying because they are going to have to lose their home over the property taxes. So I don't know. I guess what can we do to get 2 council members voted from each of the 4 neighborhoods, get our 7 ward supervisors in each of the neighborhoods, get our block captains, so we've got 280 block captains plus 28 ward supervisors representing we the people, so we can get a real budget, so we can like lay off half of the overhead, so we can, you know, get a grip. TIF corporate welfare is, I asked the council members, how much TIF corporate welfare will you give out? Well, whatever it takes. Well, that's not an answer. We don't have whatever it takes. You know, you can't like shine.
Well, a lot of things you want, you can do right now. You can have ward captains. You don't have to get city approval for that. You could have a structure. What you have to have is people who are willing to run, who are good quality candidates, and run. I mean, there's not a lot of money spent on city council races. I suppose that could change, but you know.
Yeah, when you have to campaign the entire city as your first time out of the slot, people are reluctant to do that.
Yeah, I did it. I did it. I lost the first time. I just did it again, and then I won the second time. You just got to. A lot of these things are fixable, but people have to step forward and run. I mean, I was astounded. There was a story yesterday in the Gazette that they were going to pass a plan, economic development plan for the next 5 years. I assume they probably passed it last night. But a city employee, and it was in a paragraph on the front page of that story, and there were not quotation marks around. It was a reporter reporting what he said. I noticed very carefully that there were not quotation marks, so you kind of got to give him a little bit of the benefit of the doubt, because I don't know if he said it the way it got printed, because there were no quotation marks around. But the city employee said, talking about this economic development plan for the next 5 years, that Janesville's economy is better off today than it was before the Great Recession, which means 06, 07. How could you, what world are you living in that thinks that we're better off in 2019 than we were in 06? I mean, but like I said, I have to give him the benefit of the doubt, because I'm not going to say his name, because there were quotes around it. But the reporter must have thought he said it that way, because that's the way the reporter wrote it. But the fact that there weren't quotes makes me hope he didn't say that, because that is so out of touch with.
It probably depends what he was using for his data. I mean, if he was using, for example, the unemployment rate, it's better. Are people better off? No. But depending what he was using for his data, he's probably right.
Well, the problem with all that is that people could just cherry pick the data they want.
No, I agree. I fully agree.
But I mean, for a paid city employee to say that or close to it, I was just astounded by it. I'm going. But if you are only talking to other people who agree with you already about how things are going, and I suppose a city employee would get into trouble with their boss if they said things that were negative about how things are going. Well, anyway, this has gone a different way than I thought it was going to go, but it's been very interesting to hear what you are thinking about and caring about, and I hope that the answer, Andrea, as you probably know, is people have to run, and sometimes, like in my case, you have to run twice. Maybe you have to run and lose to get your name known, and you can get lists of not how people vote, but you can get lists of who voted. They're available. So when you say you got to run campaign across the whole city, you do, but you don't have to campaign at every door. You can find out who voted on North Washington Street in the election, and you can just go to the doors that voted, and in the last spring election. And so there's ways to shrink the size of the job of running if you do that, and you get a bunch of your friends to help you and have one of them across the street from you, and you can double the number of houses you get to. We used to always do that, and they'd say, I'm here helping Tim Cullen. Who's he? Well, he's right over there. He's right over there knocking on that door over there, and I'd wave, and then so we would double the number of houses I was at just by having a person. So a lot of ways to shrink the size of the job if you want to. And I think I ran the first campaign for $485. Lost by 58 votes, but who remembers, huh? Anyway, thank you all very much for being here. Thank you.